Camille Hayes pointed at her husband across the marble foyer of their Atlanta home and said, with Derek Vaughn standing right behind her like he already owned the place, "You need to get out. Tonight. This house is mine, and my lawyers have confirmed it. Your name isn't on anything." She didn't lower her voice. She didn't flinch. She stood there in her tailored blazer, arms crossed, and looked at Elliot Hayes the way you look at a tenant who's 3 months behind on rent. Not like a man she had shared a bed with for 15 years. Elliot picked up the small bag he'd brought downstairs and said, very quietly, "Are you sure about the paperwork on this property?" Camille didn't even blink. Positive. He nodded once, walked to the front door, and left without slamming it. If you've ever watched someone walk calmly into what looks like disaster and felt the hair on your arms stand up, that's exactly what this story is. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will remind you that the quietest people in the room are often the most dangerous ones. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and leave a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit the like button too, because we are just getting started, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Elliot Randolph Hayes was not by any reasonable definition a man who made scenes. He was 44 years old, a residential architect who had spent the better part of 2 decades designing houses for other people while quietly tending to the one that bore his family's name. He was the kind of man who noticed when a door hinge was slightly off, who could read a structural drawing the way other people read a menu, who kept his opinions close and his paperwork closer. His colleagues described him as methodical. His clients described him as honest. His wife, for the last several years of their marriage, had stopped describing him at all. Camille Adair Hayes. She'd kept her maiden name hyphenated for professional purposes. Though the Hayes had mostly disappeared from her business cards around year 8 of their marriage was 46, sharp-jawed and built for rooms that required performance. She ran the southeastern division of a commercial real estate development firm called Meridian Group, and she was genuinely good at her job. She could read a room, build consensus, close deals, and project absolute certainty even when she had only half the information she needed. That last skill, as it turned out, would be the one that undid her. They had met at a design conference in Charlotte 15 years earlier. Elliot had been presenting a paper on adaptive residential architecture. Camille had been there scouting commercial properties for a client. She'd walked into his presentation 40 minutes late, sat in the front row, and spent the entire Q&A asking questions that were sharper than anyone else's. He'd asked her to dinner that night. She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. For the first 6 or 7 years, the marriage had been functional, not perfect, but functional in the way that real marriages are, full of compromises and irritations and stretches of genuine warmth. They'd settled into the Hayes family home in Buckhead, a property that Elliot's grandfather had built in the 1960s and that had passed through the family under the protection of a trust established long before either of them was born. Elliot had grown up visiting that house on holidays. When his parents moved to Savannah in their retirement, the house had formally transferred to him as the sole Hayes heir, but it had never transferred to him personally. It had transferred, as it always had, to the Hayes family trust. Camille had known this. She had signed a prenuptial agreement that spelled it out in language that was deliberately clear, because Margaret Sloan, who had been the Hayes family attorney for over 2 decades, did not write documents that could be misread. Camille had signed it, returned it to her own attorney for review, and then apparently filed it somewhere in the back of her mind where things she considered irrelevant were stored. That was the first mistake. Not the signing, but the forgetting. The second mistake was Derek Vaughn. Derek was 40 years old, a senior acquisitions director at Meridian Group, who had joined the company 3 years earlier from a firm in Houston. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence as loudly as his suits, who filled up a conference room not with intelligence exactly, but with a certain practiced momentum that read as intelligence to people who weren't paying close attention. He and Camille had begun working together on a large mixed-use development in Midtown. By the time Elliot noticed anything had shifted in his marriage, the affair had been going on for nearly 5 months. He didn't discover it dramatically. There was no lipstick on a collar, no charged text message left visible on a counter. It was subtler than that. It was the way Camille talked about Derek in conversation, a specific kind of overly casual, slightly elaborated dismissal that people use when they're trying not to talk about someone they're actually thinking about constantly. It was the pattern of her late evenings, which had always been frequent, but had taken on a new consistency. It was a receipt for a restaurant in Virginia Highland that Elliot happened to see for two people on a Tuesday evening when Camille had told him she was at a client dinner in Midtown. He didn't confront her. He sat with it for 3 days, then called Margaret Sloane. "I think I know what I'm dealing with," he told her, "but I want to understand my position before I say anything to anyone." Margaret, who had seen enough family crises in her career to remain almost completely unshockable, asked him to come to her office the following Thursday. That meeting, which lasted nearly 3 hours and covered everything from the trust structure to the prenuptial agreement to Elliot's current legal exposure, was the moment the quiet preparation began. Margaret laid out the landscape plainly. The Hayes family trust held the Buckhead property. It had paid the property taxes, the insurance premiums, the major repair costs, and had technically held title since before Elliot was born. Camille had signed an agreement acknowledging that the property was not marital property and was not subject to division in the event of divorce. That agreement was valid, witnessed, notarized, and had been reviewed by Camille's own attorney at the time of signing. "She doesn't have a legal claim to the house," Margaret said. "I know," Elliot said. "Does she know?" He thought about it. "She thinks she does." Margaret wrote something on her notepad. "That's going to be a problem." For her. Elliot asked what he should do. Margaret told him to do very little for now, to document everything, to remain calm, to avoid confrontation, and to let her begin building the complete picture of the asset situation. She also recommended that he consult a divorce attorney, which he did the following week. What neither of them had anticipated was what they found when they began pulling the financial records. Margaret's paralegal, a meticulous young man named Calvin, who had the personality of an accountant and the instincts of an investigator, turned up something alarming about 6 weeks into the process. Camille and Derek, apparently under the assumption that the Buckhead property was marital real estate, had used it as a supporting asset in not one but 3 separate loan applications, 2 tied to a new business venture they were apparently planning together, and 1 personal loan that Derek had applied for independently. In each case, Camille had signed declarations confirming the property's value and her ownership interest. In one application, she had specifically described it as marital real property, jointly held. That was not a misunderstanding. That was a misrepresentation to lenders. Elliot read through the copies Calvin had assembled and sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "She really did think it was hers." "That's the charitable interpretation," Margaret said. "The legal exposure is significant either way." He asked her to notify the relevant lenders. She advised him to wait, not for long, but until the timing was right. They needed to let the situation develop far enough that the full picture was clear and that Camille's position was thoroughly documented before anyone started making official notifications. Elliot agreed. He went home. It was 2 weeks after that conversation that Camille apparently decided she was done managing the situation quietly. Elliot still wasn't certain exactly what had triggered it. Maybe she had been waiting for a moment when she felt strong enough. Maybe Derek had encouraged her. Maybe she had done enough mental arithmetic to convince herself that the numbers worked in her favor and that delaying the confrontation was costing her something she couldn't afford. Whatever the reason, she chose a Sunday evening in October, with Derek present in the living room and Elliot sitting at the kitchen table going through a set of drawings for a project in Decatur. She walked in, poured herself a glass of water, and said, without any particular preamble, "I think we both know this isn't working." Elliot looked up. "Okay. I want a divorce. Okay." She set down her glass. She had clearly prepared for more resistance than this, and his calm was throwing her off. "I've already spoken with my attorneys. The division is going to be straightforward. My income, my accounts, my investments, those are mine. Your practice accounts are yours." "That's fair," he said. She paused. "The house stays with me." He looked at her for a moment. "Why would the house stay with you?" "Because my income has supported this household for the majority of our marriage. Because I've made the mortgage payments." "There is no mortgage," he said. She blinked. "The property taxes, then, the maintenance, carried this house financially." "That's not accurate," he said. "But even if it were, it wouldn't change the ownership structure." Her jaw tightened. "My attorneys have reviewed the situation. Property qualifies as marital, Camille." He said it very gently. "Did you actually read the prenuptial agreement?" The silence in the kitchen was brief and very loud. "I had it reviewed," she said. By your attorney at the time, yes. And she would have explained to you that the Hayes property is held in a family trust and that you signed a specific acknowledgement of that fact. That was 15 years ago. The trust doesn't expire. Derek appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. He was holding a glass of bourbon and wearing the expression of a man who had been told this would go smoothly. Camille, do you want me to call Marcus? He stopped when he registered the tension. Everything okay? Camille recovered quickly. It was one of her genuine talents. We're just working through details, she said. Elliot was about to agree to vacate the property. Elliot had said nothing of the sort, but he chose not to correct her immediately. He looked at Derek for a moment, then back at his wife. I asked you a direct question about the paperwork. I'd like a direct answer. She drew herself up. I'm confident in my legal position. He nodded slowly. All right. He pushed back from the table, folded the drawing and working on, and went upstairs to the room he'd been sleeping in since mid-September. He packed a bag with the things he actually needed, his laptop, 2 sets of clothes, his grandfather's drafting pencils, the external drive with his project files. He was back downstairs in 20 minutes. Camille was in the foyer with Derek, and she watched Elliot come down the stairs with the expression of someone who has rehearsed a scene and is waiting for the other actor to hit their mark. You'll need to leave your keys, she said. He set his house keys on the table by the door, the copies she had given him, not the set that had come with the property. That was a distinction she didn't catch. Are you sure about the paperwork on this property? He asked again. She said yes. She said it the way she said most things cleanly, finally, like the period at the end of a sentence she'd already written. He opened the front door, picked up his bag, and left. Derek said something to Camille behind him. Elliot didn't hear the words, only the tone, which was satisfied. He walked to his car in the driveway, put the bag in the passenger seat, and sat there for a minute in the dark. The house looked the same, as it always had from the outside, brick and wood and old glass, settled into its lot the way things settle when they've been somewhere long enough to belong. His grandfather had planted the 2 oak trees flanking the front walk. They were enormous now, older than Elliot himself. He started the car and drove to the extended stay hotel where he'd reserved a room 2 weeks earlier. He called Margaret from the parking lot. She asked me to leave, he said. Did you go? Yes. A pause. Good. How did she seem? He thought about it. Certain, he said. She seemed very certain. Perfect, Margaret said. I'll be in touch Monday morning. Get some sleep. He didn't sleep much. He lay in the hotel room with the curtains open and the city light coming in through the window, and he thought about 15 years of a marriage, which, when you actually tried to examine them, were not 15 years of the same thing, repeated but 15 different years, of something that kept changing until it had changed into something he didn't recognize anymore. He thought about Camille in the early years, the sharpness of her, the humor she could deploy like a tool when she wanted to, the way she'd been the first person he'd met in a long time who pushed back against his ideas with enough intelligence that the pushing back was interesting rather than exhausting. He thought about the way that had slowly become something else. Not argument exactly, but a kind of competitive noise that replaced conversation. He thought about the specific moment, somewhere around year 9, when he had realized he was designing other people's homes with more care than he was tending to his own. He didn't hate her. That was the strangest part of it. He was angry, but the anger was clean and quiet, not the hot, destructive kind. He was sad in the practical way that people get sad when something they invested in turns out not to have been what they thought it was. Not devastated, just genuinely, practically sad. What kept him awake was not grief exactly, but attention. Because he knew what was coming, and he knew that Camille didn't. And despite everything, there was something in him that was still capable of feeling the weight of that. Back in the Buckhead house, Camille moved quickly. Within 48 hours of Elliot's departure, she had a locksmith change all the locks. She had Elliot's remaining personal items books, clothing, a box of project files he'd left in the study packed into boxes and sent to his office. She told 2 of her closest colleagues that the separation had been finalized and that the house was hers. She began describing it as such in conversations, referring to it as her Buckhead property, her home base, her most significant personal asset. She hosted a dinner there for 6 of her professional contacts the following weekend. She walked people through the rooms the way someone does when they want you to understand that all of this belongs to them. She was gracious, expansive, comfortable. Derek sat at the far end of the dinner table like a preview of what came next. Her attorney sent Elliot a formal separation notice that listed the Buckhead property as a marital asset subject to equitable division. Elliot forwarded it to Margaret without comment. Margaret sent back a single line, "She's building the case for us." At his office in the Inman Park studio, where he'd been working since leaving the house, Elliot continued his practice. He took calls from clients, reviewed drawings, attended 2 site meetings, had lunch with his longtime investor Marcus Reed, who had been his financial backer since Elliot opened the studio 9 years earlier. Marcus was 61, retired from the banking industry, and had a gift for listening to people explain their problems and identifying the one variable they'd overlooked. "How are you holding up?" Marcus asked. "Fine," Elliot said. "Better than I expected." "And the house situation?" "Margaret is handling it." Marcus picked up his coffee. "You know, when you first called me about this 3 months ago, I kept waiting for you to get angry. You never really did." "I was angry," Elliot said. "I'm just not loud about it." Marcus smiled slightly. "That tends to be more effective anyway." It was. Back in the Buckhead house, Camille had begun laying groundwork for the business venture. She and Derek were planning to launch a boutique real estate investment firm targeting mid-market mixed-use properties. She'd been quietly building the concept for months, and now, with the separation underway and her confidence fully restored, she accelerated the timeline. They had investors interested. They had a board member lined up. They were planning a formal introduction dinner at the Buckhead House and Intentional Choice, designed to position the property as a symbol of Camille's stability and success. She did not know that Margaret Sloan had spent the previous 6 weeks compiling a case file that documented, with exhaustive precision, every public and semi-public claim Camille had made about the property, every signed declaration attached to the loan applications, every piece of correspondence in which she had described the house as her personal asset. She did not know that Margaret had already drafted the letters to each of the 3 lenders. She did not know that Elliot had a specific reason for not yet sending them. He was waiting for the dinner. The invitation had come to his attention through a mutual professional contact, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had worked with both Elliot and Camille at various points over the years, and who had received an invitation and thought Elliot should know about it. Patricia wasn't trying to cause trouble. She simply thought he deserved to be aware. Elliot thanked her, sat with the information for 2 days, and then called Margaret. "She's hosting a business dinner at the house," he said. "Investors, a board member, Derek's entire new venture." The pause on Margaret's end was the silence of someone revising their timeline. "When?" he told her. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking we should attend," he said. Another pause. "She changed the locks. She changed the copies," he said. "My set is original." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'll prepare everything for that evening. All of it, the trust certification, the prenup, the loan documentation, the investigation report, everything." "That's what I was hoping," Elliot said. He hung up and went back to the drawing on his desk. A residential renovation in Virginia Highland, a young couple's first house, all potential and not enough square footage. Picked up one of his grandfather's pencils and kept working. He was not a man who made scenes, but he was absolutely a man who understood that the right moment, chosen carefully and prepared for thoroughly, could say everything that 15 years of quiet had not. The extended stay hotel where Elliot had been living for 3 weeks was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had the particular quality of all temporary spaces. Everything in it was designed to be adequate rather than good. And after a while, the adequacy started to wear on you in ways you didn't notice until you caught yourself standing in the small bathroom at 6 in the morning, staring at a towel bar that was mounted, slightly crooked, and feeling irrationally bothered by it. He had established a routine because routine was what kept him from spending too much time inside his own head. He woke at 5:30, made coffee with the in-room machine that produced something only approximately related to coffee, and spent the first hour of the morning going through project files on his laptop before driving to the Inman Park studio. He worked. He ate lunch at his desk most days, or occasionally walked to the sandwich place, 2 blocks down, run by a man named Gerald, who had strong opinions about mustard and no patience for people who couldn't decide quickly. He returned calls. He reviewed drawings. He drove back to the hotel in the evenings and did it again. It was a stripped-down life, and there were moments when that felt like relief, and moments when it felt like punishment, and he was honest enough with himself to admit he wasn't always sure which was which. Margaret called him on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after he'd left the house. "I need you to come in," she said. "Calvin found something." Calvin Reese had been Margaret's paralegal for 4 years and had the specific gift of being extraordinarily thorough in a way that most people found exhausting, but that Margaret had learned to treat as a resource. He was 28, wore the same style of rectangular glasses every day, and approached financial documents with the focus of someone diffusing something. When Elliot arrived at Margaret's office on Peachtree Street that afternoon, Calvin was already at the conference table with 3 folders arranged in front of him in precise parallel. He had printed everything rather than keeping it on screen, which Margaret had told Elliot was Calvin's tell that something was serious. He only printed when he wanted to be able to point at things. "Tell him what you found," Margaret said. Calvin opened the first folder. "I pulled the public loan applications through the county recorder's office and a financial disclosure search we ran on both names. There are 3 applications. The first one is dated 8 months ago. That's the earliest." He turned the folder so Elliot could see it. "It's a business formation loan. The borrowers are listed as Camille Hayes and Derek Vaughn, doing business as Vaughn Adair Capital Partners. The collateral documentation includes a property value declaration for the Buckhead address." Elliot looked at the page. Camille's signature was at the bottom, alongside a typed declaration that read, "Residential real property, marital asset, primary collateral interest held by borrower." She described it as a marital asset, Elliot said. In writing, signed and dated. Calvin turned to the second folder. The second application is 6 months ago. Different lender, same property listed as supporting collateral. This one is a line of credit application. Again, both names. And in the asset disclosure section, he pointed to a highlighted line. She lists the property as marital real property, jointly held, estimated value $4.2 million. 4.2, Elliot said. "That's roughly accurate for current market," Calvin said, without any particular expression. "The third application is the one I'd call most significant." He opened the third folder. "This is a personal loan, Derek Vaughn's name only. But in the supporting documentation, which would have been assembled with Camille's cooperation, given that she's the one with the property interest being claimed, she provided a letter on personal stationery confirming that the Buckhead property represented a shared marital asset and that she consented to its use as collateral for the application." The room was quiet. "She wrote a letter," Elliot said. "Signed, dated, and apparently notarized." Calvin turned the page. 2 months ago. Elliot sat back in his chair. He was not surprised, exactly, but there was a difference between suspecting something and seeing it documented in triplicate on a conference table. He looked at the notary stamp on the letter for a moment, a small official circle of ink that had made something false into something that looked legally real, and felt the clean, quiet anger tighten in his chest. Margaret was watching him. "I want to be clear about what this means legally," she said. "Possible, just barely possible, that Camille genuinely believed she had a claim to the property and was acting in good faith. A court might look at it that way if her attorney argued it skillfully. But the more likely interpretation, given the prenuptial agreement she signed, the trust documentation she was shown at the time of signing, and the specificity of these declarations, is that she knew or should have known that what she was representing to these lenders was not accurate. Which means," Elliot said, "which means these aren't just mistakes," Margaret said. "These are potentially actionable misrepresentations to financial institutions. The lenders involved have legal interests that are materially affected by false information." Elliot looked at the 3 folders on the table. "What do we do with this?" "We have 2 choices," Margaret said. "We can notify the lenders now, which protects them and creates immediate legal exposure for Camille. Or we wait and continue documenting, which gives us a more complete picture and, depending on how she continues to behave, a more powerful position when everything comes to light. What's your recommendation?" Margaret picked up her pen and tapped it once against her notepad. "She doesn't know what we know, and people who don't know what you know tend to keep doing the thing that's hurting them." She paused. "I'd wait, but not indefinitely." He told her about the dinner then, the business introduction event Camille was planning at the house. He explained what Patricia Hale had told him, the investor gathering, Derek's new venture, the board member who'd been invited. Margaret's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile. "She's going to present the house as her personal asset in front of a room full of witnesses." "That's my read," Elliot said. "When is it?" He gave her the date. She wrote it down. Then we wait until then, she said, and we bring everything. He drove back to the studio afterward and sat at his drafting table without turning on his computer for a while. The studio was a single large room on the second floor of a converted building exposed brick, north-facing skylights, the smell of paper and pencil that had accumulated over 9 years. He had built this practice from nothing, or almost nothing. Marcus Reed's initial investment had given him the capital to open the doors and keep them open for the first 18 months while the client base grew. After that, the work had sustained itself, not dramatically, not in the way that got you into architectural magazines, but honestly good residential work, clients who came back, a reputation for doing what he said he would do. He picked up one of his grandfather's pencils. They were old Stedler drawing pencils, slightly worn at the barrel, with a specific weight that Elliot had never been able to find in a newer version. His grandfather, Raymond Hayes, had used them in the drafting room of the architecture firm he'd worked at for 30 years, before starting his own small practice. Raymond had designed the Buckhead house himself, not as a showpiece, but as a home, meaning that every room had been considered for how people actually lived in it rather than how it would photograph. The ceilings were generous but not absurd. The kitchen had 3 work triangles because Raymond had believed that 2 people should be able to cook without constantly being in each other's way. The study had a window seat deep enough to sleep in. Elliot had grown up in a different house, but he'd spent enough summers in Buckhead to feel the logic of the place in his bones. He knew which floorboard creaked on the 3rd step. He knew that the morning light came through the east-facing bedroom windows at an angle that made the room feel warmer than its actual temperature. He knew that the garden in the back, which Camille had largely ignored except for hiring someone to maintain it, produced muscadine grapes every September from a vine that Raymond had planted in 1974. He sat there with the pencil in his hand and thought about what it meant to build something meant to last. Then he put the pencil down and called Marcus. "I need to update you on the situation," he said. Marcus had listened. He was good at listening. Not the performative kind that involves a lot of affirmative sounds, but the real kind, where someone is actually processing what you're telling them and waiting until they have something worth saying before they open their mouth. When Elliot finished, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The loan applications," he said finally. "That's not a small thing." "No. What does Margaret think about the exposure?" "She thinks it's significant. She's going to notify the lenders, but she wants to wait until the timing is right." "And Derek does he know about the trust structure? About the prenup?" Elliot thought about it. "I don't think so. I think Camille told him the house was hers, and he believed her, and neither of them looked closely enough at the paperwork to find out otherwise." Marcus made a low sound that wasn't quite skepticism, but was adjacent to it. A 40-year-old acquisitions director building a real estate venture on collateral he never personally verified. "It does suggest some professional carelessness," Elliot said. "It suggests he trusted her the way she trusted her own certainty," Marcus said, "which isn't the same as doing due diligence." He paused. "How are you doing?" "Not the legal situation. You." Elliot considered the question honestly. "I'm okay. I'm not falling apart. I'm not sleeping great, but I'm working, and the work is good. That's something. It's a lot, actually." He returned to the hotel that evening and ordered food from the Thai place 2 blocks over and ate it at the small desk in his room while reviewing the structural drawings for the Virginia Highland renovation. The clients were a couple in their early 30s. She was a school teacher. He worked in logistics, who had bought a small bungalow that needed more than they'd realized when they bought it. They were not wealthy people. They had made the renovation budget work by giving up things carefully rather than all at once, and Elliot had spent more time on their project than the fee strictly justified. Because the problem of making a small house feel right was genuinely interesting to him, and because they had trusted him completely from the first meeting, which always meant something. He was marking up a detail on the kitchen layout when his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was brief. "This is Patricia. Thought you should know Camille's been telling people at Meridian that you've agreed to the property settlement and that the house is going through the legal process as her asset. Just wanted you to have the full picture." He stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Thank you. I appreciate it." He set the phone down and returned to the drawing. She was telling people at her company that it was already settled, that Elliot had agreed. He hadn't agreed to anything. He hadn't signed a single document. Their divorce proceedings were ongoing, and the property matter had not been formally addressed in any filing because Margaret had specifically structured their approach to avoid forcing Camille's hand prematurely. But Camille, in the way that was entirely characteristic of her, had decided what the outcome was going to be and had begun communicating it as though it were already fact. She had always done this gotten ahead of reality, through sheer declarative force, willing things into being, by saying them loudly enough and often enough that the people around her started treating them as done. Problem was that it only worked when reality was willing to cooperate. Elliot slept better that night than he had since leaving the house. He wasn't sure exactly why. Maybe it was the clarity of having seen the documents. Maybe it was knowing that the shape of what was coming had been set, and that all he had to do now was wait and prepare and let Camille keep walking in the direction she was already headed. He woke at 5:30, made the approximate coffee, and went to work. Over the next several weeks, Margaret's team assembled the complete documentation package. Calvin built a chronological file every trust record, every property tax statement paid by the trust, every insurance certificate, every maintenance invoice, all of it organized into a history that showed, without any ambiguity, exactly who owned the Buckhead property and had owned it continuously for over 50 years. He assembled the prenuptial agreement with the signed acknowledgement page flagged and ran a side-by-side comparison against Camille's loan declarations that made the discrepancy impossible to miss. Margaret also engaged a private investigation firm, a small professional operation she'd used before on family trust matters, to document the scope and timeline of Camille and Derek's relationship. This wasn't about the affair itself. Georgia was a no-fault divorce state, and the affair had limited direct legal relevance to the property question. But the timeline was relevant to understanding when and how the loan applications had been filed, and whether the business venture Camille and Derek were building had been developed using Meridian Group resources, which was a separate question with separate implications. What the investigators found, methodically, over 4 weeks of work, was that the affair had begun approximately 11 months before Elliot's formal departure from the house. It had begun during a work trip to Nashville that Camille had described to Elliot as a client event. The investigation also found, in the financial data attached to the Von Adair Capital Partners formation documents, references to a design contract that appeared to have originated with Meridian Group, a contract that had apparently been redirected from Meridian's portfolio to the new venture without documentation of proper authorization. That last finding was the one Margaret sat with longest. "This is outside our lane," she told Elliot when she explained it. "The trust matter, the property, the loan applications, those are ours to manage. The Meridian contract issue is something that would need to be reported to the company if we're going to mention it at all. And we need to be careful about how we handle it." "Are we going to mention it?" Elliot asked. "Not proactively," she said. "But if it comes up in the context of everything else, I'm not going to pretend we don't know about it." She tapped the folder. "There's a board member attending this dinner. A man named Richard Holt Hees on Meridian's Internal Oversight Committee. If he hears certain things in a certain order, he may draw his own conclusions." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to destroy her, Margaret." "I know," she said. "I want what's mine. I want the truth on the table. I want the people she misled to know they were misled." He paused. "What happens to her professionally is not something I'm orchestrating." "I understand that," Margaret said. "But you also can't protect her from the consequences of her own actions. That's not your responsibility." He thought about his grandfather, who had built the Buckhead house with the specific intention that it would outlast any one person's claim on it, who had structured the trust not out of paranoia, but out of the belief that some things should be protected from the ordinary volatility of life. Raymond Hayes had been a quiet man too, by all accounts. He had never won any awards. He had never been written up in any publication. He had simply done good work and made careful decisions and built things meant to stand. The dinner was on a Friday evening in November. The invitations Camille had sent described it as a private gathering, cocktails and dinner, to introduce Von Adair Capital Partners to a select group of investors and professional contacts. The house, which Camille had spent 2 weeks preparing new floral arrangements, caterers, additional lighting in the garden, would serve as both the setting and the implicit argument for her stability and success. The message was architectural. "Look where I live. Look what I've built. Look what I own." Elliot dressed carefully that evening, not dramatically, no suit of armor, no performance. He wore the gray sport coat he'd had for 6 years, a white shirt, dark trousers. He looked like himself, which was what he intended. He put his original house keys in his coat pocket. He drove to Buckhead. He parked on the street 1 block over and sat in the car for a moment. Through the trees, he could see the lights of the house warm and generous, the way his grandfather had intended them to be, the kind of lighting that made everything inside look like it was worth something. His phone buzzed. "Margaret, we're here. Around the corner. Ready when you are." He typed back 5 minutes. He got out of the car and walked toward the house, his hands in his pockets, the night air cold and still around him. Inside, he could hear voices. Camille's laugh, the high, carrying one she used when she was performing, which was different from the real one, which was shorter and came out of her sideways. He heard Derek's voice, lower, saying something that made a small cluster of people respond. He heard the sound of glasses and conversation, and a room that believed it was celebrating something. He put the original key in the lock, turned it, and opened the front door. The foyer was full of people. Camille was across the room near the fireplace, holding a glass of champagne, talking to a man Elliot didn't recognize. Derek was closer, just inside the living room entrance, speaking to 2 other men who had the look of money, not inherited money but earned money, kind that comes with a slight forward lean and the habit of calculating everything while appearing to calculate nothing. A few people near the door turned when Elliot entered. One of them was a woman he recognized vaguely from Meridian, a mid-level executive whose name he couldn't place. She looked at him with a small flicker of uncertainty, the expression of someone trying to locate a person in a context where they hadn't expected them. Camille turned a moment later. Her expression moved through 3 things very quickly: surprise, something that looked like irritation, and then, almost instantly, the smooth professional composure that was her most reliable mask. She crossed the room toward him with the particular walk she used when she wanted to appear in control of something she hadn't planned for. "Elliot," she said. When she reached him, her voice low and measured. "This is a private event." He looked at her. He hadn't seen her in 3 weeks. She looked the same posture, same precision, same certainty in the set of her jaw. She looked like a woman who had not yet felt the ground shift under her. "I'm aware of that," he said. "I live here." "You vacated this property," she said. "I left voluntarily," he said. "That's not the same thing as vacating legal residency." He said it quietly, not for the room but for her. "You should really know the difference." Derek had noticed them. He was moving across the room now, unhurrying himself with the practiced ease of someone who had decided that calm was its own kind of power. He arrived at Camille's shoulder and looked at Elliot with an expression that was almost friendly, the studied friendliness of a man who wanted everyone watching to see him being reasonable. "Elliot," he said, like they were colleagues running into each other at a conference. "I think there might be some confusion about tonight." "There's no confusion on my end," Elliot said. Derek reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. "We had this prepared through Camille's attorney. It's a formal notice requesting that you—" "I know what it is," Elliot said. He took it from Derek's hand, looked at the first paragraph, and put it in his coat pocket without reading the rest. "Thank you." He looked at Camille. Her eyes were steady, but there was something behind them that wasn't quite certainty anymore. More like certainty being held in place by force of will, the way you hold a door shut when something is pushing against it from the other side. "Are you sure?" he said, very quietly. "About the paperwork on this property?" She held his gaze. Around them, the room had developed the particular quality of a room where people have decided to pretend they aren't listening. The conversations hadn't stopped, but they had quieted, and the quieting was its own kind of attention. "We've been through this," Camille said. "We have," he agreed. "I just want to make sure your answer is the same." She said, "Yes. My position hasn't changed." And she said it with full Camille Hayes conviction, the voice that closed deals, the voice that ended arguments, the voice that had, for 15 years, functioned as the final word in most of the rooms she inhabited. Elliot nodded slowly. Then he turned toward the front door, which was still partially open behind him, and said, in a voice that was not loud but was entirely clear, "Margaret." And Margaret Sloane walked in, carrying a leather document case, her silver hair and her 62-year-old attorney's bearing filling the doorway with the specific authority of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any room she entered. She looked at Elliot. He nodded toward the dining table. which Camille had set beautifully for the evening crystal and white linen and the good silver that had come with the house, the Hayes family silver, passed down through the same trust that held the deed. Margaret set her case on the table and opened it, and the room got very quiet. Margaret did not rush. That was the first thing people in the room noticed, even the ones who were pretending not to watch. She opened the leather case with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this kind of thing many times and had long since stopped feeling the need to perform urgency. She removed the first document, placed it flat on the table, smoothed it once with her palm, and then removed the second, and then the third, arranging them in a sequence that was clearly intentional without being theatrical. The room had gone from politely inattentive to genuinely still. There were 14 people in the house that evening. Elliot had counted them on his way through the foyer, 8 investors or prospective investors, 2 people he recognized as colleagues of Camille's from Meridian, Derek's assistant, a woman who appeared to be a caterer's supervisor hovering near the kitchen entrance, and Richard Holt, the Meridian board member, who was standing near the far window with a glass of red wine and an expression that had shifted, in the past 90 seconds, from pleasantly neutral to watchfully careful. Camille had not moved from where she stood. She was still holding her champagne glass, though she hadn't raised it since Elliot had walked in. Derek was at her left shoulder, and the studied ease he'd walked over with had curdled slightly into something less comfortable. He was reading the room. He was good at reading rooms. It was part of what made him effective in acquisitions, and what he was reading right now was not favorable. Margaret looked up from the table and addressed the room generally, without raising her voice. "My name is Margaret Sloan. I'm the attorney for Elliot Hayes and for the Hayes Family Trust. I apologize for interrupting what I understand is a professional gathering. I'll be as brief as the situation allows." One of the investors, a compact man in his 50s, with the particular stillness of someone who had sat through many difficult meetings, said, "What is this?" "Clarification," Margaret said, "regarding the property in which you're currently standing." Camille set her champagne glass down on the nearest surface with a small, controlled click. "Margaret, this is not the appropriate venue for." "You chose this venue," Margaret said, not unkindly, but without any softness in it either. "You chose this property specifically to establish your professional credibility and your asset position with these people. That's your right. But if the representation you're making about this property is materially inaccurate, then these people have an interest in knowing that before they make any decisions based on it." The compact investor had taken a small step forward. Richard Holt, near the window, had gone very still. Derek said, "This is completely inappropriate. This is a private event, and you don't have any standing to." "I have standing as the attorney of record for the Hayes Family Trust," Margaret said, and she said it the way you set down something heavy final done, "which holds title to this property, which has held title to this property for 53 years. Picked up the first document from the table and held it so that anyone who wanted to approach could see it. This is the Hayes Family Trust certification, filed with Fulton County and current as of this calendar year. It names the trust as the sole title holder of this property. Elliot Hayes is the designated beneficiary and occupant of record." She set it down. "His name may not appear on a deed in Camille Hayes's possession because there is no deed in her possession. There is only this document, and she has no standing under it." Camille's voice came out tighter than she intended. "That trust arrangement is subject to marital property law, and the court will determine. Prenuptial agreement determines it," Margaret said. She picked up the second document. "This is the agreement signed by both parties prior to their marriage. Page 4, paragraph 7 is the relevant section. It acknowledges, in language that was drafted specifically to be unambiguous, that the Hayes Family Trust property is not marital property, is not subject to equitable division, and that the signatory," she paused just slightly, "Camille Adair, as she was named at the time of signing, acknowledges that she has reviewed the trust documentation and understands its terms." She turned the document so the room could see Camille's signature at the bottom of page 4. The room was very quiet. One of the Meridian colleagues near the back had taken out her phone. She looked at it, then put it away, then took it out again. Camille said, "That agreement is 15 years old. Circumstances have changed, and a court—" "The trust doesn't change with circumstances," Margaret said. "That's the purpose of a trust." She set the prenuptial agreement down and picked up a third stack of documents, this one thicker. "These are the property tax records, insurance certificates, and maintenance invoices for this property spanning the last 15 years. Every one of them is paid by or billed to the Hayes Family Trust. Not Camille Hayes, not Elliot Hayes, the trust. She set them down. The property's financial history is entirely consistent with trust ownership. There is no record of Camille Hayes making a single property-related payment from a personal account. Derek had stopped talking. He was standing very still, and his jaw had a quality that Elliot recognized from men who were doing rapid internal calculation and not liking the results they were getting. Camille had recovered some of her composure. She was fighting for it visibly, which was unusual. She was a woman who could normally locate her composure without looking, but she found enough of it to say, steadily, "I think everyone here should understand that this is a divorce proceeding matter, and what you're seeing is one side of a legal dispute. Courts will resolve it." The compact investor said, "Ms. Hayes, were the loan applications your firm filed using this property as collateral? Were those filed after you signed this agreement?" The question landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Camille looked at him. Her expression did not change, but the effort required to keep it unchanged was suddenly visible. "That's a matter between us and our lenders," she said. "I'm asking because I was provided documentation as part of our preliminary discussions," the man said, "that listed this property among your principal assets. If what this attorney is saying is accurate, that representation was incorrect." Margaret reached into the leather case and removed the final set of documents. She placed them on the table with the same unhurried care she'd used throughout. "These are copies of 3 loan applications filed over the past 8 months by Camille Hayes, individually, and by Camille Hayes and Derek Vaughn jointly, doing business as Vaughn Adair Capital Partners. In each application, this property is listed as collateral or supporting asset. In each application, Camille Hayes signed declarations describing the property as marital real property." She opened the top application to the relevant page. In this application, filed 6 months ago, she describes it as, she read directly marital real property, jointly held, estimated value $4.2 million. She closed the folder. "The lenders who received these applications have been notified this afternoon that the property belongs to the Hayes Family Trust and is not available as collateral or supporting asset for any personal or business loan." She looked at the room evenly. "I wanted to make that timing clear because I wanted understood that this notification happened before this gathering, not because of it." Richard Holt set his wine glass down on the windowsill. He did it quietly, but in the silence of the room the small sound carried. Derek said, "Camille." Just her name. Nothing else. She looked at him and something passed between them. Not affection, not strategy, just a mutual recognition that the landscape of the last few minutes had changed in ways that neither of them had been prepared for. It was the look of 2 people realizing simultaneously that the ground they'd been building on was not what they'd thought it was. Elliot, who had been standing near the foyer entrance since Margaret began, had not said a word. He'd watched the room. He'd watched Camille most closely, not with satisfaction, or not only with satisfaction, but with the complicated attention of someone who had shared 15 years of their life with another person, and was watching that person in a moment of genuine collapse and still felt, underneath the anger and the resolution, something that was not quite pity, but was related to it. She had made these choices. She had made them confidently and without sufficient care. But she was still a person he had once loved in the real, specific way you love someone, when you've lived alongside them long enough that their particular habits and fears have become part of your understanding of the world. He was not here to enjoy her suffering. He was here because the truth needed to be in the room. One of the investors, a younger woman who had arrived with the compact man and who had not said anything until now, said, "Are there legal consequences for the misrepresentations on the loan documents?" Margaret said, "That's between the lenders and their legal counsel. We have notified them of the factual situation. What they choose to do with that information is their determination. But potentially significant," Margaret said. "Yes," Camille said, "I want everyone here to understand that this situation is being presented selectively, and I have legal counsel who will." "Camille," Elliot spoke for the first time since Margaret had begun. His voice was even. "Stop." She looked at him. In 15 years of marriage, he had said stop to her perhaps 3 times, really said it, with that particular weight behind it. Each time it had surprised her because it was so rare. Surprised her now. He said, "You told a room full of people that you owned this house. You signed documents telling lenders you owned this house. And you've been telling your colleagues for weeks that the settlement was already done and the house was yours. He paused. None of that was true. You know it wasn't true. And now he gestured to the room, know it too. There's nothing more to manage here. The caterer's supervisor had slipped back into the kitchen. One of the Meridian colleagues was already in a quiet conversation on her phone near the hallway. Two of the investors had begun moving toward the foyer in the indirect, careful way of people who want to leave, but don't want to be the first ones to move decisively. Richard Holt crossed the room. He was a tall man, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the careful bearing of someone who had spent a career managing risk on behalf of other people. He stopped at the table and looked at the documents Margaret had laid out. He didn't touch them. He just looked. Then he said to Elliot, "I appreciate you allowing this to come to light." Elliot said, "I didn't do it for your benefit, but I'm glad you were here." Holt nodded. He looked at Camille, not unkindly, not cruelly, but with the flat professional assessment of someone doing an internal calculation and arriving at a conclusion. Then he retrieved his coat from the chair where he'd left it and said good night to no one in particular and walked out. Derek said quietly, "To Camille, I need to make some calls." His voice had lost all of its professional ease. What was underneath was something narrower. Not panic, but the close cousin of it, the feeling of someone who is committed to a position and is now looking for the fastest route out of it. Derek Camille started. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said, and he walked toward the foyer, stopped briefly to say something to his assistant in a voice too low to carry, and left. The room continued to empty. There was no dramatic no raised voices, no scene. People simply found reasons to conclude their evenings, gathered their things, offered brief and slightly stiff goodbyes to Camille that contained no warmth and no commitment, and left. Within 15 minutes of Margaret's final document hitting the table, the house held only 4 people: Elliot, Margaret, Camille, and one of the caterers who was quietly clearing glasses in the kitchen and giving every impression of not hearing anything. Camille was sitting down. She had found one of the dining chairs and lowered herself into it at some point during the evacuation of her guests, and she was sitting now with her hands flat on the table, looking at the documents Margaret had spread across the white linen. The floral arrangement her caterer had set up as a centerpiece white and ivory flowers in a low crystal vase, expensive and correct, was pushed slightly to one side, and she was looking at the trust certification the way you look at something that has been in front of you for a long time without your seeing it. Margaret began gathering the documents back into the case. She worked quietly and made no commentary. Camille said, without looking up, "I did read it. The prenup. When I signed it." Elliot was standing near the fireplace. He didn't respond immediately. "I read it and I thought—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought the trust was a technicality. I thought 15 years of living here, of running this household." She stopped again. "My attorney at the time said it was significant. I remember her saying that. I just didn't—" She shook her head. "I decided it didn't apply the way it was written." "It applied exactly the way it was written," Elliot said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, which he'd expected. Camille did not cry in front of audiences, even reduced ones. "I know that now. You should have known it then." "I know that too." There was a long silence. The caterer in the kitchen set something down with a muted clank of glassware. "The loan applications," Elliot said. "Did Derek know about the trust?" She was quiet for a moment. "I told him the house was mine. I believed it was. But you knew about the trust. I thought it was a structure, a legal container. I didn't think it actually prevented." She stopped. "Look back at the documents. No, that's not honest. I knew. Somewhere I knew." She said it the way people say things they've been carrying for a while and have finally put down. Not relieved exactly, but quieter. "I just wanted it to be different." Elliot looked at her for a long moment. She looked tired. Not the performance tired she sometimes deployed to signal that she was working harder than everyone around her, but the real kind, the specific exhaustion of someone whose certainty has been withdrawn from them all at once. "The lenders," he said. "Margaret notified them this afternoon. Whatever they decide to do with that is on them. But I'm telling you now so you have time to prepare." She looked at him with something that was genuinely surprised. Not that she'd expected cruelty from him exactly, but that she'd expected less than this. "Why are you telling me?" He thought about it. "Because I'm not trying to ruin you. I never was." He picked up his coat from the arm of the sofa where he'd set it when he arrived. "I'm trying to get back what belongs to my family. That's the whole of it." She said nothing. He said, "You need to call your attorney tonight, Camille." "Not tomorrow." "Tonight," she nodded once, very slightly. It was the smallest he had ever seen her look. Margaret closed the document case and said, "We'll see ourselves out." Elliot followed her to the foyer. He stopped at the door and looked back at the room. The good lighting, the oak floors his grandfather had laid, the fireplace with its original mantel, the white linen table with its displaced flowers and scattered paperwork and empty champagne glasses. It looked like what it was, the aftermath of something that had been built on a wrong assumption. He turned off the foyer light out of habit and walked out. Outside, the November air was sharper than it had been an hour ago. Margaret walked beside him down the front path between the two oak trees toward the street, her document case under her arm, her breath visible in the cold. "How do you feel?" she asked. He considered it honestly. "Like it's over, or like the part I was responsible for is over. The legal process still has several months." "I know. But this part," he gestured back vaguely at the house. "This part is done." She nodded. They reached the sidewalk. Her car was parked around the corner, and she paused before heading toward it. "You were good in there." "You said almost nothing." "There wasn't much I needed to say." "No," she agreed. "There wasn't." She walked toward her car. Elliot stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, looking up at the front of the house through the oak trees. The lights inside were still on. He could see Camille's silhouette through the living room window, the shape of her standing now, probably with her phone to her ear, calling her attorney, doing the thing he told her to do. He walked to his car, got in, and drove back toward Inman Park. He did not feel triumphant. That wasn't the right word for any of it. What he felt was something closer to the feeling you get when a structural problem you've been tracking in a building finally fails in exactly the way the engineering predicted it would. Not satisfaction at the failure, but a grim, tired confirmation that you had read the situation correctly and that the reading had mattered. He called Marcus from the car. "It's done," he said when Marcus picked up. "How did it go?" "The way it was supposed to." He changed lanes, heading east on the freeway. Holt was there. "Richard Holt? The board member?" "He saw everything. He left early. I don't know what he does with it. That's not my call, but he knows." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Elliot, I'm sorry it had to go this way." He thought about Camille sitting at the dining table, hands flat on the white linen, looking at documents that had dismantled something she'd spent months constructing. Thought about Derek walking out with his phone already in his hand. He thought about 14 people who had arrived to invest in something and had left with a different kind of education. "So am I," he said. But it had to. He drove through the city with the heater running and the windows slightly cracked because he'd always thought better with a little cold air. Skyline was doing what the Atlanta skyline does at night, glittering and self-important and somehow still beautiful in the way that cities are beautiful when you're moving through them rather than stopped. He thought about the Buckhead house, which tomorrow and the day after that would still be standing exactly as it had stood for 53 years, indifferent to all the human drama that had been conducted inside and around it. It had outlasted his grandfather. It would outlast this. What it would not do is become something it wasn't. Back in the Inman Park studio the next morning, Elliot arrived at 6:30 and started a pot of real coffee on the machine he kept on the side table near his drafting desk. A proper stovetop espresso maker, Italian, the one object in the studio that he'd bought for himself rather than for the work. He drank it standing at the window, looking down at the street while the city came awake below him, and he thought about what came next. The legal process, as Margaret had reminded him, still had months in it. The divorce filing would proceed. The property matter would be addressed formally, though the documentation made its resolution relatively clear. Camille's attorneys would do what attorneys did: find angles, raise arguments, negotiate, and Margaret would answer all of it from a position that was essentially unassailable. It would take time. It would cost money. It would require patience, which was the resource Elliot had always had more of than people gave him credit for. His phone rang at 7:15. "Margaret, I heard from the attorney for the first lender this morning," she said. "They're reviewing the application file. They've put the loan in suspension pending the review. All 3 lenders. We'll hear from the other 2 today or tomorrow. It'll be the same outcome. They're not going to sit on this." He said, "What kind of exposure does Camille have?" Margaret was careful with her answer. "That depends on how the lenders characterize the declarations. If they pursue it aggressively, it could be significant. If they're satisfied with the loan suspension and property clarification, They may not push further. A pause. I wouldn't want to predict which way they go. All right? He turned away from the window. And the Meridian situation? That's not ours to manage, she said, and he could hear in her voice the same thing she'd said in her office 2 weeks earlier. Holt was in that room. He saw the timeline. He saw the loan documents. He's a smart man who has been on that board for 9 years and who knows what a redirected contract looks like. She paused. Whatever Meridian decides to do internally is their process. He said he understood. He thanked her and hung up. He sat down at his drafting table and opened the Virginia Highland renovation drawings. The young couple's kitchen layout was still marked up from Tuesday's own pencil notes in the margins, tiny and precise, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write small because good drawings left no room for large print. He picked up one of his grandfather's pencils and began to work. He had been sitting there for about 40 minutes, focused on a problem with the cabinet positioning relative to the window line, when his email chimed. He glanced at the subject line and then looked at it more carefully. It was from an address he didn't recognize, a personal Gmail account with the name Noah Bennett in the sender field. The subject line read, "The Meridian Design Contract Reaching Out." He opened it. The email was 3 paragraphs, carefully written, not aggressive. Noah Bennett explained that he was a young architect, 27, 2 years out of graduate school, who had submitted a proposal 8 months ago for a mixed-use residential component of a Meridian Group development project. He wrote that his proposal had been rejected in the first round without feedback, which was normal enough, but that he had recently heard from a contact at Meridian that the contract had been awarded to a newly formed outside firm, One, whose principals had been Meridian employees at the time his proposal was submitted. He wasn't making accusations, he wrote. He just wanted to understand what had happened. He had worked on the proposal for 2 months. It was the most serious professional effort of his career to date. And the timing of the contract's redirection, as he'd pieced it together from the contact at Meridian, corresponded almost exactly with the formation of Von Adair Capital Partners. He ended the email by saying he understood if Elliot wasn't the right person to contact, but that Elliot's name had come up in connection with the trust and property matter that seemed to be related, and he didn't know where else to start. Elliot read the email twice. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He thought about a 27-year-old architect who had spent 2 months on a proposal, had it rejected without explanation, and had watched a contract go to people who had access to his work before it disappeared from consideration. He typed back, "I received your email. Can you come to my studio at 10 tomorrow morning? I'd like to see the proposal." He hit send, picked up his grandfather's pencil, and went back to the kitchen layout. Outside, the November morning was settling into itself, cold and overcast, the kind of Atlanta day that felt more like the North than the South, stripped of the warmth and softness that usually made the city feel generous. The streets below were wet from overnight rain. The oak trees in Buckhead, 2 miles away, would be nearly bare by now, their leaves down, their branches clean against the gray sky. The house would be standing in it, solid and old, and exactly as it had always been, waiting with the patience of things built by people who understood that good structures outlast the arguments held inside them. Noah Bennett arrived at the Inman Park studio at 9:58, which Elliot noted without commenting on it. Punctuality in young architects was either a sign of genuine professionalism or anxiety, and in Noah's case, within about 4 minutes of his arrival, it became clear it was both. He was 27, as his email had said, and he had the specific look of someone who had been raised to present himself carefully without having quite enough money to do it effortlessly. A good coat that was a season old, shoes that had been polished recently, a leather portfolio case that was quality but worn at the corners. He was mixed race, lean, with the kind of focused eyes that suggested he processed rooms visually before he processed them any other way. He looked at the studio when he came in, really looked at it, the way architects look at spaces, reading the light and the proportions and the way the furniture related to the walls before he looked at Elliot. "Thank you for responding," he said. His handshake was firm without being performative. "I wasn't sure you would." "Sit down," Elliot said. "You want coffee?" "Please." Elliot poured 2 cups from the stovetop maker and set one in front of the chair across from his drafting table. Noah sat, put the portfolio case on his knees, and did not immediately open it, which was the right instinct. He was waiting to be invited rather than launching in, which told Elliot something about how he'd been trained. Tell me about the Meridian proposal, Elliot said. Noah had clearly rehearsed this, but not over-rehearsed it. He talked the way people talk when they know the material well enough that the rehearsal has become invisible. He explained that the project had been a mixed-use development in the old Fourth Ward residential units above a ground-floor commercial component, a mid-scale project, not glamorous but exactly the kind of work that would represent a significant early career commission for a practice the size of his. He'd learned about the open call through an industry listing, had verified through a Meridian contact that small firms were genuinely being considered, and had spent 8 weeks developing a proposal that addressed the site's specific constraints with a residential component that was more carefully considered than the standard developer template. What made your proposal different? Elliot asked. Noah opened the portfolio case and took out a set of boards large format, printed, the kind you present to a client in person. He leaned them against the edge of the drafting table so Elliot could see them. They were good. Not flashy. The renderings were clear and honest rather than artificially glamorous, but the thinking behind them was evident. The residential component used a split-level section that responded to the site's grade change in a way that created private outdoor space for each unit without eating the ground floor commercial area. It was the kind of solution that looked simple after someone had worked it out, but would have taken real time to arrive at. Elliot looked at the boards for a while without saying anything. How many rounds did they review? He asked finally. According to the listing, 3 rounds. I was told I didn't advance past the first. Noah paused. I didn't get feedback. That's not unusual for a first-round cut. But the firm that received the contract, Von Adair, wasn't listed as a participant in the open call at all. They weren't on the registered firms list, and their formation date is 2 weeks after the submission deadline. Elliot looked at him. How do you know their formation date? Business registry search. It's public. Noah's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, but it contained frustration that had been sitting in him for months and had learned to keep itself contained. I'm not saying anyone copied my work. I don't know that. But a firm that didn't exist when submissions were due ended up with a contract that I was told went to a first-round rejection list, and the principals of that firm were inside Meridian's acquisitions department when my proposal was in their system. Elliot said, "Did you submit a complaint to Meridian?" I sent an inquiry. I got a response from someone in procurement saying the contract had been awarded through an appropriate process, and they couldn't share details of the selection. He looked at his coffee cup. I'm a 27-year-old with a 2-person practice. Can't afford to file a formal complaint against a company like Meridian without evidence. If I'm wrong, I've burned a bridge I might need. If I'm right, and I can't prove it, I've still burned the bridge, and I look like someone who makes accusations he can't back up. It was an honest assessment of his situation, and Elliot respected it for being honest. He looked at the proposal boards again. The split-level residential section. The way the building addressed the street. The careful thought about how natural light would move through the units across the day. Leave these with me, he said. Noah looked at him carefully. Can I ask what your connection to this is? Your email about the trust matter. I wasn't sure how that related. The principals of Von Adair were my wife and her colleague, Elliot said. We're currently in divorce proceedings. The property matter you read about is part of that. He paused. I have no interest in protecting what they built. And I know someone who was in the room last Friday evening who may find your timeline very relevant. Noah was quiet for a moment. Richard Holt, he said. Elliot looked at him. He's on the oversight committee. My contact at Meridian mentioned his name. Noah set down his coffee cup. I don't want to be the person who torches someone's career without cause. I have no interest in that. I understand, Elliot said. But you also submitted a serious proposal in good faith. And if the process that rejected it was compromised, you have a legitimate professional interest in that being examined. Noah nodded slowly. He looked at the boards leaning against the drafting table. His own work, 8 weeks of it, carefully printed and presented and rejected without explanation. What do I do? He asked. Write down everything you know with dates, Elliot said. Every contact, every submission timestamp, every communication you received from Meridian. Send it to me. I'll pass it to the right person. He picked up his coffee. Don't contact Holt yourself. Don't contact Meridian again. Let this work the way it needs to work. Noah said, and if Meridian decides not to do anything with it, then you've lost nothing you haven't already lost, Elliot said. But if they do something with it, You may get a second look at a contract that should have been yours. It wasn't a promise. Elliot was careful not to make it sound like one. But Noah Bennett picked up his portfolio case and stood and said, "Thank you," in the way people say it when they mean something larger than the word itself, and left. Elliot sat at his drafting table after the door closed and looked at the proposal boards for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called Marcus. "I need to talk to you about something that isn't directly related to the legal situation," he said. "All right," Marcus said. He explained Noah Bennett, the proposal, the timeline, the formation date of Von Adair. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was his habit, and when Elliot finished, there was a brief silence before Marcus said, "You're thinking about passing this to Holt." "I'm thinking about it." "Do you know Holt well enough to approach him directly?" "Not well. We've met twice at industry events." He knows who I paused. "After Friday evening, he may be more receptive than he would have been otherwise." "Probably," Marcus said. "He's a careful man. He watched everything that happened in that room, and he left without saying much. That's not the behavior of someone who's going to ignore what he saw. It's the behavior of someone who's going to go back to his office and start pulling threads. That's my read, too." Marcus said, "What do you want to do for this kid?" Elliot thought about Noah Bennett's worn portfolio case, the proposal boards that showed genuine thinking, the careful way he'd contained his frustration and laid out his situation without asking for anything he hadn't earned the right to ask for. "I want someone to look at his work with a fair process," he said. "That's the whole of it." He forwarded Noah's email to Margaret with a note asking whether it was appropriate to bring the timeline to Holt's attention and in what form. Margaret responded within 2 hours. "Pass it to Holt as factual information. No advocacy, no request. Let him determine its relevance." Elliot drafted a brief email to Richard Holt that evening. He attached Noah's preliminary timeline, the proposal registration date, and the Von Adair formation document. He wrote 3 sentences of context and nothing more, and sent it before he could second-guess the wording. Holt responded the next morning with 2 words, "Received. Thank you." It was the kind of response that could mean almost anything or nothing, and Elliot chose not to read into it. The following weeks were the strange administrative grind that no one prepares you for when a marriage ends. Not the emotional weight of it, which people discuss, but the sheer practical monotony of it. The paperwork, the disclosures, the exchange of financial documents through attorneys, the scheduling of calls that then got rescheduled, the sensation of your life being processed through a system that was designed to be fair and was occasionally fair and was always, always slow. Camille's attorneys had initially filed a motion challenging the trust's classification of the property as non-marital, arguing that Camille's financial contributions to the household over 15 years had created an equitable interest regardless of the prenuptial agreement. Margaret responded with the complete payment history, the trust records, the insurance certificates, the maintenance invoices, and a detailed analysis of what Camille's actual financial contributions to the property had and had not been. The motion was not resolved quickly, but Margaret's position was strong enough that the opposing attorneys began moving toward negotiation rather than litigation within 3 weeks of filing. Camille did not call Elliot during this period. He had not expected her to. They communicated through attorneys, which was appropriate and also in its sterile efficiency. Occasionally strange, the reduction of 15 years to a series of formal documents exchanged between intermediaries, each of which referred to them as the parties rather than by their names. Derek Vaughn's departure from the picture was faster and less dramatic than Elliot had expected. He had called Camille the morning after the dinner. She had told her attorney, who had told Margaret, who had told Elliot to inform her that he had retained his own legal counsel and that it would be inappropriate for them to have direct communication while both of them were potentially subjects of the lender's reviews. He had been professional about it, apparently. Clinical. It had the quality of someone executing a planned exit rather than experiencing a spontaneous one. Camille had told her attorney she was not surprised. Elliot believed that was probably true. She was not a person who was easily surprised by people behaving according to their natures, even when it hurt her. She had known Derek was a man who moved efficiently and minimized his exposure when situations became complicated. She had simply assumed she would never be the complicated situation. The lenders moved at different speeds. The first, the one financing the business formation loan, completed their review within 2 weeks and formally withdrew the loan instrument, citing material misrepresentation in the collateral documentation. They sent a letter to Camille's personal attorney notifying her of their findings and reserving the right to pursue further action. Whether they would exercise that right was, as Margaret had said, their determination. The second lender, the line of credit, suspended the account pending review and ultimately closed it. No further action was announced, which Margaret read as a pragmatic decision. The loan had not been funded, so the exposure was limited, and lenders generally preferred resolution to litigation when resolution was available. The third lender, the one for Derek's personal loan, was the quietest. Elliot learned through Margaret that the loan had also been suspended, and that Derek's attorney had entered into discussions with the lender's legal team. What those discussions involved was not something Elliot was privy to, and he didn't seek to become privy to it. What he knew was that the financial architecture Camille and Derek had built for Von Adair Capital Partners had been constructed on a single load-bearing assumption that the Buckhead property was available as collateral, and, without that assumption, the structure had no foundation. The investors who had been in the room Friday evening did not re-engage. The board member, who had been meant to formalize the company's oversight relationship, quietly withdrew from consideration. Von Adair Capital Partners, which had never formally launched, was dissolved by mutual agreement of its two named principals 6 weeks after the dinner. Elliot found out about the dissolution through a business registry search his attorney's office ran routinely. He noted it and did not feel what he'd expected to feel, which was some version of vindication. What he felt instead was something closer to the feeling at the end of a very long project. Not satisfaction so much as the recognition that a particular sustained effort was complete. He was also, around this time, genuinely tired. Not emotionally collapsed. He had not collapsed at any point in this process, which he was aware said something about him, though he wasn't entirely sure what. But he was tired in the way that people get tired when they have been holding something difficult very carefully for a very long time, and the careful holding has cost them more than they acknowledged while they were doing it. He was sleeping 7 hours and still waking up feeling like 6. He was eating adequately, but without much interest. He was doing good work at the studio, but the work felt like it was running on a system that needed maintenance. Marcus noticed. Of course, Marcus noticed. He was 61 years old and had spent a career reading people, and Elliot had known him for 9 years and understood that Marcus's silences were usually more observant than other people's direct questions. They had lunch at a place in Ponce City Market that Marcus liked for reasons Elliot had never fully understood. It was loud, and the tables were too close together, and the menu changed every few weeks, but he'd long since stopped arguing about it. "You look like you've been grinding gears," Marcus said after they'd ordered. "I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. I said you look like you've been grinding gears." Marcus poured water into both their glasses, which was the kind of small habitual gesture that in a friendship of 9 years had become unremarkable. "The legal stuff is winding down. The lender situation is resolved. What are you doing with yourself?" It was a good question, and Elliot didn't have an immediate answer for it. What had he been doing? He had been working. He had been managing the divorce process. He had been sleeping in an extended-stay hotel room and eating Thai food from a box entre the Sitzlungssugardu and keeping everything moving. He had been competent and controlled and present and genuinely okay, and underneath all of that, he had not yet done the thing where you stop running the process and actually feel what the process has cost you. "I haven't gone back to the house," he said. "No? Not since that night." He looked at his water glass. "Margaret has been handling everything that needed handling there. I've had no reason to go." Marcus said, "It's still your house." "I know." But Elliot thought about it honestly. "But the last time I was there, it was what I said to you on the phone that night. It felt like the end of something. And going back, even though it's mine, feels like walking into a space where something happened that I haven't fully processed yet." He picked up his fork. "Which sounds more self-aware than I usually am." "It sounds accurate," Marcus said. "I'm not avoiding it. I didn't say you were. But you should go back. Not for the legal process, or the divorce, or any of that. Just go back to the house." Marcus looked at him directly, the way he did when he wanted to make sure something landed. "It belongs to your family. It's yours. You need to put your feet in it again and remind yourself of that." Elliot went the following Saturday morning. He drove to Buckhead in the gray early light, parked in the driveway rather than on the street, and sat in the car for a moment. The November trees were bare now, the oaks his grandfather had planted reduced to their architecture, the bone structure of them. the branching pattern, which was actually more beautiful than when they were in leaf, if you were willing to look at it that way. He got out of the car and used his original keys on the door and went in. The house was cold. Camille had apparently lowered the heat before she'd begun staying at a hotel herself. Her attorney had confirmed 2 weeks earlier that she had vacated the property, which the court had formally established as Elliot's right of occupancy during the divorce proceedings. The place had the specific quality of a house that has been lived in but is not currently being lived in. The air had settled. The rooms had gone quiet in a way they don't when people are moving through them daily. He walked through slowly. He was not inspecting, exactly. He was just walking through his own house, room by room, relearning the dimensions of it. Kitchen, where his grandfather had planned 3 work triangles. The study with the window seat. The living room where Camille had stood with her champagne glass 4 weeks earlier. The dining room table with its white linen still on it. She had left it there, either forgotten or abandoned, and it had a quality of tableau about it. The good silver still in its arrangement. Crystal glasses standing where the caterer had left them. He went upstairs. His old bedroom, the room he and Camille had shared for 14 of their 15 years together, had her things in it still, perfume on the vanity, a reading lamp with a slightly tilted shade, clothes in the closet that she had not yet collected. It was strange in the way that most intimate abandonments are strange. Not sad exactly, but specific in its residue. The particularities of a person's daily life persisting past the person. He stood in the doorway of that room for a while, not going in. Then he went down the hallway to the room at the east end of the house, the one his grandfather had used as a study, which had better light than any other room in the building, because Raymond Hayes had understood orientation and had deliberately placed his own working space to receive the morning sun. It was empty now, had been empty for years, used for storage in the latter part of the marriage, filled at some point with boxes that Camille had never gotten around to unpacking, and Elliot had never pressed her about. Most of the boxes were gone. She'd apparently cleared them when she moved out. What remained was a large room with good south and east windows, oak floors in better condition than the rest of the house because they'd had less traffic, and the ghost of a built-in bookcase on the north wall that Raymond had removed himself sometime in the 70s when he'd converted the room to a drafting studio, leaving only the bracket holes in the plaster. Elliot stood in the room and felt the light move across the floor as the morning sun cleared the east tree line. He thought about Noah Bennett and his worn portfolio case and his 2 months of genuine work and the careful way he'd laid out his situation without dramatizing it. He thought about a 27-year-old architect who needed somewhere to work and a project that was worth working on. He took out his phone and sent Noah a message. "Can you come to the Buckhead house next week? I want to show you something." Noah responded in under 2 minutes, yes. When? He put his phone away and looked at the room again. The light had moved another inch across the floor. He could see in his mind, with a particular spatial clarity that was the specific gift his profession had given him, what the room could be. Proper workspace, drawing tables, a materials library along the north wall where the bookcase had been. The east windows reworked slightly to bring more morning light without compromising the street elevation. It was a good room. It had always been a good room. It had just been waiting for someone to use it correctly. He went back downstairs and walked through the kitchen and out to the back garden, which was bare and winter brown but not neglected. The maintenance service Elliot had kept on through the trust was reliable, and the beds were properly cut back for the season. The muscadine vine on the south fence Raymond's vine, planted 1,974, had dropped its leaves, but its canes were still thick and well established along the old wire supports. It would bear again in September. It always did. He stood in the garden in the cold morning air with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the back of the house his grandfather had designed and built and placed in the care of a structure strong enough to outlast individual human mistakes. His phone rang. "Margaret." "I have news from Meridian," she said. He tensed slightly. "About Noah Bennett?" "Indirectly. Richard Holt convened a review of the Von Adair contract 3 weeks ago. I have a contact at Meridian's legal department, not a source. Just someone who mentioned it in passing, and apparently the review found sufficient irregularities in how the contract was awarded that the company has decided to reopen the competition." A pause. "Derek Vaughn has also been placed on administrative leave, pending a separate internal investigation into his conduct during the period in question." Elliot said nothing for a moment. "What about Camille?" he said. Her situation is complicated, Margaret said carefully. She was not named in the internal investigation, as of what I've heard. But the review touched on decisions made during the period when she held significant influence over the acquisitions pipeline, and there are questions being asked about those decisions broadly, not just the Von Adair contract. A pause. Her position at Meridian was, let's say, it's uncertain. Process that. I didn't give Holt Camille's name specifically. You gave him a timeline, Margaret said. He drew his own conclusions from it, which is what you intended. I intended him to look at what happened to Noah Bennett's proposal. He looked at the broader picture, Margaret said. That's what oversight committee members do. He stood in the garden for a moment after hanging up. The muscadine vine, the bare beds, the cold air coming through his coat. He hadn't wanted to end Camille's career. He had said that to Margaret weeks ago, and he'd meant it. But he was also a man who had spent his professional life understanding that structures either hold load or they don't, that a building either rests on solid foundations or it doesn't, and that you cannot wish an unsound structure into stability by wanting it hard enough. What had happened to Camille's professional position was the result of what she had done and what Derek had done, and the two of them building something together that did not rest on solid foundations. He had wanted the truth in the room. The truth had been in the room. What it illuminated beyond the property question was not something he had orchestrated. It was simply what the light showed when it reached into corners that had been kept dark. He called Marcus on his way back through the house. Holt reopened the Meridian contract competition, he said. Derek is on administrative leave. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And Camille? Her position is uncertain. Nothing formal yet. Another pause. How do you feel about that? Elliot was walking through the kitchen, his hand trailing along the counter. His grandfather had chosen a simple stone, nothing fancy, chosen for durability rather than style. He thought about the question honestly. I feel like things are working the way they should, he said, which isn't the same as feeling good about it. He stopped at the window above the sink, which looked out at the garden. She made those choices. Derek made his. I'm not their consequence, he paused. But I'm also not pretending the consequence isn't happening. That's about as honest as you can be, Marcus said. I'm working on it. He spent another hour in the house that morning, moving through it with a growing sense of reclamation that was quieter and more complicated than he'd expected. It wasn't triumphant. It was something more like responsibility, the weight of a thing that is yours reasserting itself, reminding you that ownership requires presence, that the best structures need people in them to fulfill what they were built for. Before he left, he stood once more in the east room with its good morning light and its oak floors and its bracket holes in the north wall. He was already calculating, in the way he always calculated spaces and proportions, and the relationship between light source and work surface, what this room needed, what it was asking for. He pulled the door closed behind him and went downstairs, turned the heat up to a reasonable temperature, locked the front door with his original keys, and got in his car. He had work to do. Noah Bennett showed up at the Buckhead house on a Tuesday morning in early December with his portfolio case and a thermos of coffee he'd made himself, which Elliot found oddly touching, the kind of detail that told you something about a person, that they'd thought to bring their own coffee to a meeting at someone else's house rather than assuming anything would be provided or available. Elliot had turned the heat up to a livable temperature 2 days before and had spent those 2 days in the house, sleeping in the guest room rather than the master bedroom, beginning the slow process of inhabiting the place again. It was not comfortable yet. It was the way returning to anything is after an absence slightly off, the proportions familiar, but the feeling not quite matching the memory. He had relearned where the light switches were, which was muscle memory anyway, and had unpacked the bag he'd brought from the hotel, which took all of 11 minutes, and had made coffee in the kitchen with a maker that was his wife's, and that he'd used for years and was now simply his. He'd also begun working on the east room. Not construction, nothing structural yet. He'd cleared the remaining boxes Camille had left, swept the floors, and spent an evening sitting in the room with a notepad and his grandfather's pencils, working through what the space wanted to become. He wasn't designing for himself. He was designing for the kind of work a young architect does when he finally has somewhere to do it properly. A space that was honest about what it was, functional rather than prestigious, lit by real daylight rather than the flat overhead lighting of a shared office or a converted living room. He showed Noah the room without preamble. He opened the door and stood back and let the morning light do the explaining. Noah walked in and did the thing that good architects do in any space. He stopped moving, turned slowly, looked at the windows, looked at the floor, looked at the ceiling height. He was quiet for almost 30 seconds, which in a first impression is a long time. "This is a serious room," he said finally. "It was my grandfather's drafting studio," Elliot said. He removed the built-in shelving himself at some point. "You can see the bracket holes in the north wall." Noah looked at the north wall. "I'd put them back," he said immediately. "Custom shelving rather than the original materials library. Flat files below, open display above." He paused. "The east windows want to be taller, not wider. Taller, to bring the morning light further into the room without—" He stopped himself. "Sorry, you know this." "No, keep going," Elliot said. Noah looked at him with a slight wariness, the kind a young person develops when they've been caught having opinions in front of someone more senior and aren't sure if it's going to cost them. "I'm making assumptions about your space." "You're reading the space correctly," Elliot said. "And I asked you here because I want to offer it to you." The wariness became something else, not quite disbelief, but the careful held-back response of someone who has learned that things that sound good usually have conditions attached. "As what?" "As a working studio," Elliot said. "You and whoever else you work with. The room is yours to use during normal working hours, and there's a second room across the hall that could serve as a meeting space. The arrangement would be informal, no lease, no fee for the first 6 months. After that, we'd talk about what's fair." Noah looked at him for a long moment. Why? It was the right question, and Elliot had expected it. He told him the truth, that the room had been empty too long, that good spaces needed to be used for what they were built for, that he'd looked at Noah's proposal boards and seen someone doing the kind of honest thinking that deserved a place to develop. He said it plainly, without embellishment, because Noah was clearly the kind of person who heard embellishment and became more suspicious rather than less. He also said, "The Meridian contract is being reopened. I don't know what the new competition will look like or what your chances are, but you should be working somewhere that lets you put your best effort in if the opportunity comes back around." Noah looked out the east windows. The morning light was doing exactly what Elliot had said it would, coming in at a low winter angle that crossed the floor and caught the grain of the old oak in a way that made the wood look warm rather than just brown. "I have one other person," Noah said. "A collaborator. Simone Park. She handles the computational side of things, structural modeling, energy analysis. We work together on everything." "Bring her," Elliot said. "The room is big enough for 2 desks, comfortably, and 3 if you don't mind the company." Noah turned away from the window. "I need to think about it. Of course. I don't—" He stopped. Tried again. "I don't want to be someone's project. I mean that respectfully. I want to work here because it's a good space, and the arrangement makes sense, not because someone feels like they're correcting a wrong by helping me." Elliot looked at him. He was 27 years old, and he already understood something that a lot of people never worked out. That there is a version of help that diminishes the person being helped, and that you have to know the difference before you accept anything. "I'm not correcting a wrong," Elliot said. "I had nothing to do with what happened to your proposal. What I did do is put the timeline in front of someone who could look at it properly. What Meridian does with that is between them and their own conscience." He paused. "This room is available because it's my house and it's been empty, and you need a place to work. That's the whole of it." Noah nodded once, slowly. "I'll talk to Simone. We'll let you know by Friday." They said yes on Thursday. The divorce was finalized on the 14th of January, a date that had no particular significance and that Elliot chose to treat as administrative rather than emotional, which was easier than it might have been at some other period of his life and harder than he told most people. The terms were what Margaret had projected months earlier. Camille retained her personal accounts, her investment portfolio, and the personal property she'd removed from the house. She received no claim on the Buckhead property, which remained in the Hayes family trust as it always had. The business accounts and client relationships of Elliot's practice remained entirely his. They had always been legally separate from marital finances, structured that way by Margaret's advice years before anyone had anticipated needing the separation. Camille's alimony position was limited by the terms of the prenuptial agreement and by the income differential, which had never actually favored her as much as she'd believed. Elliot's practice was not a large operation, but it was profitable and debt-free, and his financial standing was more stable than Camille had accounted for in her mental model of their marriage, which had always characterized her income as the primary structural element and his as supplementary. That characterization had never been fully accurate, and the financial disclosures required by the divorce process had made it accurate in neither direction. She signed the final documents through her attorney. There was no phone call, no final conversation. The marriage concluded on paper, efficiently and without theater, which was probably the correct ending for two people who had run out of things to say to each other long before they ran out of paperwork. Margaret called Elliot when it was finalized. "It's done," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Wait until the property tax assessment comes in. The trust is going to need to update the beneficiary documentation now that the divorce is final, and that process is about as exciting as it sounds." He laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine, the first one in a while that didn't feel like he was performing normalcy. "Schedule whatever you need." "I will, Elliot." She paused, and when Margaret paused, it meant something, because she was not a woman who paused for effect. "Your grandfather would have handled this the same way. I knew him for 20 years, and that's not a compliment I'm handing out casually." He sat with that for a moment after she hung up. Raymond Hayes had been dead for 12 years. Elliot's memories of him were the kind you get, of grandparents selective, compressed, filtered through the particular gaze of a child who understood less than he thought he did about the person he was watching. He remembered Raymond at the drafting table in the East Room, bent over drawings, pencil moving in the focused, unhurried way of someone for whom the act of marking paper was completely natural. He remembered the quality of his silences, which had been similar to Elliot's own, not cold, just concentrated, the quiet of a person for whom most things worth doing required attention rather than noise. He had never been a man who made scenes, his grandfather. Elliot had heard that from enough people who'd known him to believe it wasn't just family mythology. Raymond Hayes had built the house on Buckhead, designed it himself, placed it in a trust, tended to it for 50 years, and passed it forward with the specific intention that it should outlast the uncertainties of any individual life. That was not sentiment. That was engineering. It was the understanding that good things require structure as much as they require care, and that structure without maintenance fails eventually, and that maintenance without structure is just hope. Elliot had tried to maintain the marriage. He had not been a perfect husband. He was honest enough with himself to acknowledge the specific ways he had failed at that. The distraction of his work, the periods of withdrawal, the times when his instinct to process things privately had read to Camille as indifference, when it was actually something more complicated. He had not been indifferent. He had been perhaps insufficiently legible, a man whose interior life was real and active, but rarely externalized in ways that reassured the person living alongside him. He had also married someone who needed reassurance in a way that he had not fully understood when he'd asked her to dinner in Charlotte 15 years ago. The sharpness he'd found so compelling across that conference table had been real, but it had been armor as much as character, and underneath it there had been a woman who needed to win almost everything in order to feel secure. That need had expressed itself over the years in ways both large and small, and in the end it had expressed itself in the worst possible way, not just by claiming what wasn't hers, but by sincerely believing she deserved it simply because she decided she did. He did not excuse the loan declarations, or the lock change, or the cold performance in the foyer with Derek at her shoulder. Those things had been wrong, but he had lived with the person who had done them long enough to understand that they came from somewhere from a woman who had built her entire sense of self on the premise that what she wanted, she could take, and who had never developed the internal mechanism for sitting with the knowledge that some things are not available regardless of how hard you want them. That was not pity. It was just honest accounting. January moved into February, which in Atlanta meant the particular late winter state of almost spring some days, cold enough to remind you that winter hadn't fully released. Other days carrying a warmth that was premature and that you knew not to trust yet, but couldn't help responding to. The muscadine vine on the back fence was still bare, but the buds were beginning to swell on the lower canes, which was a quiet promise rather than a declaration. Noah and Simone had been working in the East Room for 6 weeks by then. They kept reasonable hours in by 8:30, out by 6 most evenings, occasionally later when something had their attention. Simone Park was 29 precise, methodical, with a dry humor that surfaced at unexpected moments, and a habit of talking through structural problems while pacing, which Elliot could hear occasionally through the floor when he was working in the kitchen below. They had brought their own equipment, 2 large format monitors, a plotter, a set of reference materials, and had arranged the space with a competence that suggested they'd set up working environments before and knew what they actually needed versus what they thought they needed. He gave them the room and largely left them to it. He was not their supervisor or their patron, and he'd meant what he'd said about not wanting to be a correction. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings, they overlapped in the kitchen. He was an early riser. They arrived at 8:30, and there was a window of about 20 minutes where they all made coffee and occasionally talked, and those 20 minutes had the comfortable quality of people who occupy the same space without pretending to be more connected than they are. Simone had a directness that reminded him slightly of Camille, though he was careful not to make too much of that comparison. It was the directness of a technically confident person, not the directness of someone building a fortress. Noah was quieter. He drew obsessively, in the way that young architects do when they're in that specific window of their development where the hand and the mind are learning to work together at speed. And Elliot sometimes caught himself looking at the drawings Noah left on the table during lunch breaks with the feeling of recognition, not that the work was like his own, but that the hunger behind it was familiar. The Meridian contract reopened formally in late February. Elliot knew about it before Noah did, through Margaret's contact at Meridian's legal department, and he said nothing because it wasn't his announcement to make. Noah found out through the industry listing the same way he'd found the original open call. He came downstairs to find Elliot in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, and he said, "The Meridian project is back up. The old Fourth Ward mixed use." Elliot poured coffee. "I saw that. Did you know this was coming?" "I knew Holt had reopened the review," Elliot said. "I didn't know when the new competition would be announced." Noah stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his jacket pockets. He had the expression of someone who is trying to decide whether to feel hopeful or to protect himself from feeling hopeful. It's a different process this time. They've restructured the submission requirements. There's a site visit component and a presentation round before the shortlist. "That's a better process," Elliot said. "More work for the firms submitting, but a better process." "I'm going to enter again," Noah said. It was not a question or a request for approval. It was a statement delivered simply, in the tone of someone who has already made the decision and is informing you of it. "I know," Elliot said. Noah looked at him. "The proposal I showed you, the split-level section, the way I handled the grade change. Do you think it's strong enough?" It was the first time Noah had asked him a direct professional opinion, and Elliot understood that it mattered, that the asking represented something about trust that hadn't fully been there before. He thought about the boards he'd looked at for a long time, that first morning in the studio. The honest rendering. The grade solution that was actually a solution rather than a workaround. The residential component that had been thought through by someone who cared about how people actually live in buildings rather than how buildings look in photographs. "The concept is strong," he said. "The presentation needs work. Your boards communicate to architects, not to decision makers. People evaluating this are going to be a mixed room. Some will read drawings. Most won't. You need to make the drawings talk to both." Noah nodded, absorbing this. "Would you look at the revised submission before I finalize it?" "Yes," Elliot said. "Bring it down when you're ready." He brought it down 4 weeks later, and Elliot spent 3 hours at the drafting table going through it with him, not remaking the work, but asking the questions that helped Noah see what he hadn't yet communicated clearly, which is a different thing and a more valuable one. Simone sat in the corner during this review, taking notes on her laptop, occasionally asking structural questions that sharpened the conversation in useful directions. It was good work, honest and collaborative, and by the end of it, the submission was significantly better than what Noah had walked in with. "The grade solution is the heart of it," Elliot said as they were finishing. "Lead with that. Don't bury it in page 4. "I was worried it looked too simple," Noah said. "Simple is what it looks like when the problem has actually been solved," Elliot said. "Complicated is what it looks like when it hasn't." Noah submitted the proposal on a Thursday in late March. He and Simone went out for dinner to celebrate the submission, not the win, which didn't exist yet, just the submission, which was its own completion. Elliot knew this because Simone mentioned it the following morning with the particular lightness of someone who'd had one glass of wine more than she usually did and was not unhappy about it. The shortlist came out 6 weeks later. Noah Bennett's firm was on it. He came downstairs when he got the notification. Elliot heard him on the stairs, which had a specific creak on the third step, and had a brief disorienting moment of the past overlapping the present, and he stood in the kitchen door and said, "We made the shortlist," and his voice had a quality in it that was something between disbelief and a kind of deep, gathered relief. The feeling of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and has just been told the position was worth holding. "Good," Elliot said. "There are 4 firms on it." "I know. The site visit and presentation round are the deciding factor." "Do you know when?" 3 weeks. Elliot nodded. "Then you have 3 weeks of work to do." Noah laughed, genuine, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is actually happy rather than performing happiness. "Yeah," he said, "we do." He went back upstairs. Elliot stood in the kitchen for a moment and listened to the sound of footsteps crossing the floor of the east room above him, the particular rhythm of a person moving through a space with purpose, doing the thing they are built to do. He thought about his grandfather designing this house with that very quality of purpose, every room considered. Every relationship between spaces deliberate. The east room placed precisely to receive the morning light because Raymond Hayes had understood that the place where a person works should give them something to work with. Not luxury, just the right conditions. Elliot went back to his own drafting table in the study and picked up one of his grandfather's pencils and returned to the residential renovation he'd been working on. A house in Decatur this time, couple in their 60s who had raised their family in a split level and wanted to stay there through the next 30 years, if the structure would let them. It was the kind of project that required thinking carefully about how people age in houses, about what changes as mobility changes, about the difference between a home that works now and a home that continues to work when the people in it need different things from it. It was not glamorous work. It was the work, and he was entirely in it. It was in April that Camille called. He was in the garden when his phone rang a Saturday afternoon, mild, the first genuinely warm weekend of the year. He'd been assessing the muscadine vine, which was fully leafed out now and producing well after its winter dormancy. The new canes extending along the old wires supports with the patient ambition of something that has learned to grow by growing rather than by planning to grow. He looked at her name on the screen for a moment before answering. "Elliot," she said. "Camille." He stood in the garden with the phone to his ear. The afternoon light was coming through the back of the property at a low angle, making the garden look warmer than it was. "I wanted to call," she said, and then paused for what felt like a gathering of something, nerve, or words, or the specific courage required to make a call you're not sure you should make. "I don't have a reason. Or I have a reason, but it's not I'm not calling to negotiate anything. Margaret's people and my people are still finishing up the last paperwork, but that's not why I'm calling." He waited. "I've been thinking about the marriage," she said, "about what it actually was. And I wanted to ask you, do you ever think about it? Not the end of it, the actual thing." He thought about how to answer, honestly, which took a moment. "Yes," he said, "in the way that you think about something you invested in seriously. I remember specific things, not a highlight reel, just specific moments. Conference in Charlotte. The first 2 years, when we were still figuring out how to share a kitchen. The summer we drove up the coast and you got lost in every bookstore we passed." He paused. "I remember the good parts as good. They were real." She was quiet for a moment. "I was good at the beginning," she said, and he heard in her voice something he hadn't heard there often, not self-pity, which wasn't really Camille's register, but something more like honest assessment. I was trying. For a long time I was trying." "I know," he said. "And then somewhere I stopped trying and started just declaring," she said. "That's the word I keep coming back to. Declaring. Like if I said a thing firmly enough it became true." She stopped. "The house. Derek. All of it. I declared my way through it and pretended the declarations were the same as reality." He didn't respond to that immediately because he wasn't sure a response was what she needed. Sometimes people call you to say something that they've needed to say, and the saying is the point rather than the answer. "What are you doing now?" he asked after a moment. "Professionally. Consulting," she said. "Independent. I left Meridian." She said it without drama, which was how he knew it had cost her considerably. Meridian had been the architecture of her professional identity for over a decade. Leaving it, or being structurally pressured toward leaving it, which was how he understood it to have happened, was not a small thing regardless of the circumstances that had led to it. I have 3 clients so far. It's slower than I'm used to. You'll build it, he said. And he meant it, not as consolation, but as a genuine assessment of her capabilities, which he had always respected even when he'd stopped enjoying living alongside them. Camille was genuinely talented at what she did. She was going to be fine. It was going to take longer than she wanted, and look different than she'd imagined, but she was going to be fine. She seemed to hear the directness in it, because she was quiet for a moment in a different way, a receiving kind of quiet. Thank you, she said. Take care of yourself, he said. You too. A pause. Is the garden looking all right? I always meant to do more with it. He looked at the muscadine vine, the bare beds that were greening up now, the 2 old oaks out front whose branch structure he could see from the corner of his view. It's looking like itself, he said, which is probably enough. She said goodbye and hung up. He stood in the garden for a while after that. The afternoon was deepening into early evening, the light going amber and low, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look worth looking at. He felt the phone call settle in him. Not as resolution exactly, because resolution was probably too neat a word for what the end of a 15-year marriage felt like when you were actually standing in it. It settled more the way that final conversations settle, not clean, not without residue, but complete in the way that things are complete when they've reached their natural end rather than being cut short or dragged past their time. He had loved her. He was clear on that, even now. He had loved the specific person she had been in the years when she was being that person fully and without the armor getting in the way, and he had stayed long enough in the diminished version of the marriage to know that the failure had not been simple or one-sided. He had his own accounting to do, his own specific failures that he carried and would carry. The withdrawal, the silence where engagement was needed, the times he'd let things become distant because addressing the distance felt harder than tolerating it. What he had not done was declare. He had not decided that the world was arranged according to his preferences and behaved accordingly. He had not built financial structures on false foundations and convinced himself the foundations were sound because he wanted them to be. That distinction mattered, not as moral superiority, which he had no interest in, but as the simple difference between the choices he had made and the choices she had made, which were both real and which had both contributed to what the marriage had become and how it had ended. He went inside and made dinner, nothing elaborate, pasta, and what he had in the refrigerator, the kind of meal you make when you're not performing eating for anyone. He ate it at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, which he had been doing consistently since moving back in, because the dining room still felt like the room where something had happened, and he was not ready to make it feel ordinary again. That would come. These things came gradually rather than all at once, which was both the inconvenient and the merciful truth about recovery from anything significant. Noah won the contract in May. Elliot heard about it not from Noah but from Margaret, who had a Meridian contact who let her know, and he was sitting at his drafting table when the text came through, and he sat with it for a moment before he heard Noah's footsteps on the stairs, fast, not running but fast, the footsteps of someone who is trying to contain something physical and not entirely succeeding. Noah came into the study doorway. He was holding his phone, and he had the expression of someone who has just received information that they prepared for and still weren't fully prepared for. "We got it," he said. Elliot set down his pencil. "I know. Congratulations." Noah laughed, the same genuine, unguarded laugh from the morning of the shortlist notification, but bigger now, carrying more weight. Simone appeared behind him in the hallway, and she was smiling in the controlled way of someone who is very happy and has decided that the controlled version is appropriate for the current setting, though her eyes told a different story. "When do you start?" Elliot asked. "They want the site visit schedule confirmed by next week," Noah said. "Full project kickoff is July." He shook his head slightly. "I keep waiting for the part where they tell me there's been a mistake." "There hasn't been a mistake," Elliot said. "You submitted the strongest proposal. You won it fairly." "The second time," Noah said. "The first time was taken from you," Elliot said. "The second time you took it back. Those are different things, and you should know the difference." Noah looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of someone filing something away. Then he nodded. "Thank you for the room, for looking at the proposal." For he paused. "For the whole thing. The room needed someone in it," Elliot said. "And the proposal was already good. I just helped you show it properly. He picked up his pencil again, which was the signal that he was returning to work, and that the moment, which had been real and complete, was finished. Go celebrate. Both of you. They went. He heard them on the stairs and then the front door, and then the sound of a car starting in the driveway and moving off into the street. The house was quiet. He sat at his drafting table in the study, working on the Decatur renovation, the aging couple's split level, the specific problem of a house that needed to adapt without losing what had made it a home for 30 years. It was precise work, the kind that required sustained attention to small things, and he was entirely capable of that kind of attention. He had always been capable of it. It was one of the things he was genuinely good at. Outside, the May evening was settling in warm, the first real warmth of the year, rather than the tentative warmth of April, the city coming fully alive in the way it does when winter is finally, categorically done. Through the study window, he could see the 2 oak trees his grandfather had planted, fully leafed now, enormous in the evening light, casting shadows that moved slowly across the front walk as the last of the sun moved west. He thought, not for the first time, about what it means to build something meant to last. Not the romance of the idea. He was too practical for the romance of it. He meant the actual work of it, the specific daily choices that either accumulate into something durable or don't. The structure has to be sound. The materials have to be honest. The foundation has to be built on something real, rather than something you've decided to treat as real, because it's more convenient. And then the whole thing has to be maintained. Not obsessively, not from anxiety, but from the ordinary commitment of someone who understands that even the best-built things require attention. The marriage had failed on most of those counts, and not only because of Camille. He had let the foundation shift without addressing it, because addressing it had required a kind of directness he'd been too conflict-averse to sustain. He had maintained the surface, while the structure underneath became something different from what it had started as. That was on him. He owned it. What he was doing now, here in this house, at this drafting table with his grandfather's pencils, this was the work of building something new on a foundation that had always been real. Not a new marriage, not a new version of the life he'd had. Something that was genuinely his own, made from his actual choices, rather than the choices he'd made to accommodate someone else's declarations. It was slower work than he would have liked. Some mornings he woke in the guest room. He had still not moved back into the master bedroom, and he was not yet sure when he would. And he had decided to stop judging himself for that. And the first thing he felt was not optimism, but a flat, procedural sense of the day ahead, which was honest rather than depressing. He was not a man who believed that recovery from anything moved in a clean upward line. He knew that some days were better and some were worse, and that the overall direction was what mattered rather than any individual day. He was making something. It was imperfect and partial and ongoing. He was making it on solid ground. The trust documentation update that Margaret had mentioned was completed in June, a 3-week administrative process that was exactly as exciting as she'd promised it wouldn't be. Elliot signed the updated beneficiary certification, reviewed the property tax structure, and confirmed the insurance coverage, all of which were tasks that felt essentially identical to a dental cleaning, necessary, professionally administered, and completely unglamorous. He did them without complaint and thanked Calvin, who had done most of the actual work, by bringing a decent bottle of wine to Margaret's office at the end of the process. Margaret accepted it with the grace of someone who knew exactly how much work Calvin had done, and also exactly why the gesture was directed at her. "You're settled in the house?" she asked as he was leaving. "Getting there," he said. "And the young architects in the East Room?" He thought about Noah and Simone upstairs, the sound of their work drifting through the floor, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the kitchen, with coffee, and the particular low-frequency professional conversation of people who were thinking about the same kinds of problems he thought about. It was not a family. It was not meant to be. But it was a house being used for what a house is for inhabited, alive. Its rooms doing what rooms do when people are actually in them. "They're good," he said. "The work they're doing is good." Margaret nodded. "Good," she said, as though that settled something she'd been curious about. He walked out of her office into the June afternoon, which was already warm in the particular Atlanta way, not oppressive yet, still carrying the sweetness of the season before it becomes the brutal season, and stood on the sidewalk on Peachtree Street for a moment before going to his car. He had built nothing dramatic in the past year. He had not remade his life into something that made a compelling story of triumph. He had made careful decisions, mostly the right ones, and managed a difficult situation with as much integrity as he could maintain on the days when maintaining it was hard, which was not every day. He had protected what belonged to his family. He had been honest with the people who deserved honesty. He had helped a young architect get a fair shot at something that should have been fair the first time. That was, he thought, enough. More than enough, actually, when he was being honest about it, rather than measuring it against some imagined version of what recovery was supposed to look like. He drove back to the Buckhead house through the afternoon traffic, which was worse than it needed to be, because Atlanta traffic was always worse than it needed to be. And he pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking up at the two oaks. Raymond Hayes had planted them in 1966 when the house was new and the trees were saplings, and the idea of them becoming what they currently were must have required a specific faith in the patience of growing things that not everyone is capable of. You plant a tree for someone who isn't born yet. You design a house to outlast your own understanding of it. You put the right things in writing, not because you're certain of the future, but because you're serious about the present. He got out of the car and walked up the front path between the oaks and unlocked the door with his original keys and went inside, into the house that had always been his and that he had finally fully come home to. Upstairs, through the ceiling, he could hear the rhythm of Noah Bennett crossing the floor of the east room. The particular sound of someone moving through a space with purpose, going from the drawing table to the window and back again, working through something, the same thing every architect does when the problem is almost solved but not quite. The same restless pacing that Eliot himself did when a design was 90% there, and the last 10% was hiding somewhere between what he knew and what he hadn't figured out yet. He stood in the foyer and listened to that sound for a moment. Then he hung up his coat, went to the kitchen, started the stovetop maker, and returned to his own work. There is a particular kind of person who believes that possession is the same as ownership, that declaring a thing loudly and confidently enough eventually makes it yours. Camille had been that person, and it had cost her in ways that she was still, somewhere across the city in her new consulting life, working through the accounting of. Eliot did not think about her daily anymore. He thought about her the way you think about a significant chapter of your life when you've closed it and moved on to the next one occasionally, with the specific clarity of retrospect, without the heat of the thing itself. What he had come to understand, in the months of quiet work that followed everything that had happened, was that the opposite of declaring is not silence. It is not passivity, not withdrawal, not the absence of ambition. The opposite of declaring is building. It is the actual daily work of making something real from materials that are honestly assessed, on a foundation that has been genuinely examined, toward a structure that is designed to hold weight rather than to impress from a distance. His grandfather had known this. Raymond Hayes had expressed it in brick and wood and a family trust and 2 oak trees he would never see reach their full size. He had expressed it in drafting pencils that his grandson still used 50 years later because they were the right weight and had never needed to be replaced. Eliot Hayes was not a man who made scenes. He was a man who made things meant to last. That was when he examined it honestly in the quiet of the house his grandfather had built, enough of a legacy to carry forward. Stovetop maker began to hiss on the kitchen burner. He went to take it off the heat before it boiled over. That was the thing about the stovetop maker. You had to pay attention. You had to be present. It didn't wait for you. And he poured the coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden, where the muscadine vine was doing exactly what it did every year without being asked, extending its new canes along the old wire, growing in the patient, uncelebrated way of things that have learned to trust the season. September would come. The grapes would come with it. He drank his coffee and went back to work.